Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back. It is exactly 8:38 a.m. News and views on Salam Media, and it is finally here. The BRICS summit will be starting soon. We've already been told about all of our road closures and everything else that is going to be impacted by all of these VIPs that will be attending the summit. Let's talk to the Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and that, of course, is Ashraf Patel, about BRICS, the impact, positively and negative impact on us as a country, our economy, and a whole lot more. Assalamu alaikum to you, Ashraf. Welcome to the program.
Walaikum salam, Julie and listeners. Hope you're all well today.
Ashraf, I picked up on an interview on one of the mainstream channels the other day, and the people pretty excited about the BRICS summit, suggesting that this is going to create employment opportunities. My thinking is that the BRICS summit is happens over a 2-week period, if not less. Yes, we're going to have lots of foreign visitors to the country, but in that small window period, is it going to have a meaningful long-term impact on our economy? And I know you're not an economist, but I also know you're very, very well versed with all of these issues, geopolitical and otherwise.
Thank you, Julie. So I think it would be helpful to look at the BRICS format. So countries that host BRICS in any particular year, such as South Africa, there's a series of activities from the beginning of the year. And in the last several months, um, all the BRICS ministers, so every ministry in the country, so you would have the BRICS trade ministers, the BRICS ministers in IT and telecoms, the BRICS foreign affairs ministers, the BRICS ministers on skills development and labor. So they would have their programs throughout the year, and they meet quite regularly, almost every month, or senior officials from the various departments to coordinate programs and activities. So it's a very busy year for a nation that hosts BRICS. And as you know, South Africa has been hosting it in 2023. The highlight, of course, is what is called the Head of State Summit, which is next week, 22nd to 24. So those are 3 days, and that's where the head of states, the leaders of the nations meet to elaborate on all the work that has been going on over the past several months by the various ministries. So that's at a state level, government level. Then you have a second tier called the BRICS Business and Investment Councils. And this is where all the business corporations and SMEs meet quite regularly. And they have their own formats and their own summits. And they discuss a range of issues, particularly around trade and investment within BRICS and BRICS Plus. Then you would have what is called the third tier, which is the academic forum. And that's where the various academics and universities looking at strategic issues in the global situation, whether they be climate change, trade, economics, finance, reforming the global financial system. So the academics have their own forums, and they met in May over 5 days to look at all the big issues. So you have these layers, and then finally you have BRICS Civil, where the civil society and labor comes together, and they discussing quite pertinent issues around not just BRICS but the global South. So this is the actual format of the BRICS platforms.
Okay, I've heard this terminology being bandied around over the past few days to the build-up of BRICS. When they talk the global South, are they talking only Africa or all of the countries and continents below the equatorial belt, or would it be just below the Europe, that divide between Europe and Africa? And I guess the global South should also then include possibly Southeast Asia, Australia, and all of those countries. Are those the countries we're looking at when we talk global South?
A very good question, Julie. So, in terms of kind of international relations and sociologically, the global south is mainly a terminology, if you like, to refer to countries that were colonized before. So, that would
Ah,
be, yes. So, it's not necessarily a geographical construct. So, you would have Australia and New Zealand that's geographically in the south, but they part of the north because they were part of the colonial administrations. So global south essentially would be Southeast Asia, Latin America, Middle East, large parts of the world that were colonized in the last 2 or 3 centuries. And these are the decolonial countries that are living in a kind of decolonial situation, stroke democratic system only in the last several decades. So that is the focus of BRICS. All BRICS nations are part of the global south. All of them have been
okay.
in some way colonized. Yes,
It seems that they want to correct that situation from being colonized
yes.
in the past because we haven't still shaken off the yokes of colonization, have we? It still bears very heavily on us as the global south in some form or the other. But be that as it may, we're also hearing that the BRICS expansion is on the rise, with many other nations set to join or willing to join. Please elaborate.
Yes, yes. So all these nations form part of the global south that are sort of queuing up to join BRICS. Many of them see different kinds of potentials, especially in the domain of economics and finance and trade. So trade is the most important driver. The BRICS nations, led by China, has got a model of currency, creating an alternative currency uh, less dependent on the US dollar, which would make regional trade and global trade much more easier for developing countries. Many of them are commodity exporters, and because of the volatility with the US dollar in the global system, that is a challenge for these nations. So they see a lot of value in the new BRICS currency, for instance, or they see potential for a better deal on infrastructure development through the new development bank, which is the BRICS Bank, for instance. And finally, they see better opportunities at a political level when the BRICS bloc engages in the G20, for instance, where there is a big call for reforming uh, multilateral institutions such as the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions are still powerful, but BRICS institutions are coming out with more appropriate models. And I think this is the real attraction of BRICS and the reason many nations block. So, yes, there is a serious opportunities available for nations that join.
All right, another very important question is the impact on the world economy from unilateral approaches in breach of international law. And they also noted that the situation is complicated further by unilateral economic coercive measures such as sanctions, boycotts, embargoes, and blockades.
Yes, yes. Remember the international system since the last 2 centuries or several centuries, and in the post-Cold War era and the World War II era, is characterized by hierarchies. So the most powerful economically and militarily dominate the world order. This has been the case, especially in the last 75 years. And you've seen post World War II, those nations that have the power, particularly the US and the G7 nations and the UN Security Council members, have the military economic power to shape international institutions and rules in their favor. We've seen this with all the wars in the last 3 or 4 decades, particularly since the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, um, nations that don't comply in a certain order uh, are treated with sanctions, as we've seen with Iran and now with Russia. So the use of sanctions globally is one of many tools the powerful nations have because they in control um, of the economic and financial system and the banking system. So that gives them extraordinary powers, arbitrary powers, that many of the time is not in line with international law or norms. And I think this is an unequal situation which BRICS nations seek to correct and create more balance in the system, particularly in a situation where the most powerful nation, the US, that was the superpower for the last century, is now in a decline, just as Britain was at the end of the 18th century in decline. So we're seeing the rise of new powers like China that is still young, that is new, that has the capabilities, the technology, the economic system that is challenging this hegemony, for instance. And that is where you're going to have different interpretations on everything from sanctions, from the South China Seas to the Middle East to the Africa Union trying to mediate on a number of conflicts in Africa. You'll have the big powers having very different views on what and how to resolve these conflicts, and they have different tools and mechanisms. So the international relations order is very complicated, and but the power is shifting towards the east at this point in time. Yes.
Okay, we have a question from a listener. Let me read it out to you. What is the relationship between Brazil and South Africa? Ashraf, did you hear the question? Okay, it seems as
Mhm.
if, did you hear the question?
About
Would you
Brazil.
like to respond? Yeah, what is the relationship between South Africa and Brazil?
Yes, yes. Um, well, Brazil and South Africa has got very interesting relations. Um, since the election of President Lula 20 years ago in his first two terms, there's been significant trade and investment and cultural people to people links between Brazil and Africa, particularly South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Portuguese, Lusophone Africa. So there are links between South Africa and Brazil. There's very similar kind of socio-economic, racial, and spatial commonalities. So Brazil has got significant multiracial population, but it is also predicated upon racial hierarchies, just like South Africa is. So there's a lot to learn from a sociological point of view. The Workers' Party in Brazil under President Lula has made significant gains in meeting socio-economic challenges, in meeting job creation challenges, land reform, giving access to the land to indigenous people. Uh, that has created a lot of food security, and it has increased the sustainable development goals attainment. So yes, Brazil is a very good role model under the Workers' Party, under PT, President Lula. So yes, there's significant opportunities for trade and investment between South Africa and Brazil. Yes, there are lots of challenges, the one being the poultry. Remember, Brazil is an agricultural powerhouse, and its exports of beef, of poultry, of all the agricultural commodities, I think it is only second to the US globally. And as a result, it can produce agricultural products cheaper, and therefore it does dump, very similar to the US and Europe. And these would be one of the sticking points in the relationship between South Africa and Brazil. But overall, in terms of global institutional change, in terms of the reform of the UN system, the IMF, the World Bank, President Lula in Brazil is a very reliable, independent partner of South Africa and Africa.
Okay, so we are talking with Ashraf Patel on our segment called BRICS Breakdown, and we're going to have these segments running pretty continuously throughout the summit. Ashraf, we have about 4 minutes left to wrap up time. Still many, many more questions coming your way, but let me just pick two or three very important questions that we do need answered now. The ministers have expressed serious concern over continued conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, of course. And they've also endorsed the joint statement by BRICS deputy foreign ministers and special envoys at their meeting on the 26th of April this year.
Yes, Julie, remember there's significant conflicts. Just if you look at the Niger coup, for instance, the conflicts in Sudan, in Eastern DRC, in northern Mozambique, in Chad, in Mali, you're having multiple conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa and MENA. Yes, BRICS nations in all their communiques and statements have showed a commitment to resolving these conflicts. But more importantly, conflict resolution is only part one of a process. More importantly is the rebuilding. So how do we rebuild Afghanistan? How do you rebuild Sudan? How do you rebuild Libya? How and the World Bank and IMF has not succeeded for decades, and therefore the BRICS institutions would be able to come with a more appropriate model to rebuild these nations so that they can get some kind of economic and social development growth and peace. Because without peace, there can be no development. So the BRICS nations are committed to the model of the United Nations system of peace and multilateralism. And I think that is the key takeaway for BRICS. It's about reforming multilateral institutions for the global south, but also for the humanity as a whole. And I think that is a very positive posture or positive intent of the BRICS nations.
And finally, the importance of the inclusion of women in peace processes, including in conflict presentation and resolution, peace building, post conflict reconstruction and development, and of course, ongoing sustenance of peace.
100%. There's the BRICS Women's Forum, and gender is integrated in all the activities of BRICS and the UN, because in conflicts, it's the children and women that suffer the most, and we need to integrate the voices of women and youth in all these conflict situations, and more importantly, in the peace and development processes, because that is going to develop sustainable peace post the conflict. And this is where we can work together within the framework of the United Nations and the framework of the Africa Union. Hopefully, there will be resolutions on these conflicts, but it's a huge undertaking and needs a lot of resources. And I think that is where BRICS can play a meaningful role.
Ashraf, I have to ask you this question, a short, sharp answer, please, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Do you think that the Palestine question will be put on the table at all?
Yes, the Palestine question is always on the BRICS agenda, and there's always a statement in all the communiques of the BRICS nations on Palestine. If you go through all the communiques over the last decade, so Palestine is a priority. BRICS is supportive of the Palestinian struggle and to find a solution to the conflict. Therefore, you find the efforts of China, for instance, reaching out to create peace in the Middle East amongst the partners. So you can see the positive role for BRICS and Palestine. For instance, President Lula of Brazil is a great supporter of the Palestinian cause. So yes, some members of BRICS like Brazil, South Africa, even China, Russia, are very close to the Palestine situation. Unfortunately, India under the Modi government has taken a more pro-Israel position because of the ideological situation. But in terms of majority of BRICS nations are definitely part of for peace in the Middle East and in Palestine.
And I think that Modi question needs to be left aside for a more detailed discussion, hopefully next week sometime. But as always, a pleasure talking with you and your very deep insights into all of these geopolitical matters. You are the Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Ashraf Patel, thank you indeed for your time on the show this morning. Assalamu alaikum to you.
Walaikum salam.
We apologize for the delay in the transmission there, but what can I say? Blame it on Eskom. All right, it is 8:58 News and Views on Salam Media. Standing by is our news correspondent with the bulletin for the morning, and that, of course, is Zai Jadwood. So please stay with us.